Usually, I love Fosi Audio products because they perform at or above their very low price points. But my testing of the Fosi Audio ZD3 DAC didn't quite follow that script. Without realizing it, I created an accidental blind test with the ZD3, and the results were truly shocking. Before we get to what went wrong and what it means for potential buyers of the ZD3, let's talk about the great design of the Fosi Audio ZD3 DAC. This is a fully balanced DAC for $176 US, and it doesn't look at all like all the other basic black box DACs on the market. At the same time though, it isn't some weird shape that won't stack particularly well under or on top of other components. It's got the usual Fosi Audio black casework with the orange control knob, and that's balanced really nicely by the circular display on the other side. The other great design choices that Fosi Audio made with the ZD3 were the inclusions of the HDMI ARC connector, so you can use this with a TV-based setup for movie watching or gaming, and that's in addition to the usual optical, coaxial, USB and Bluetooth inputs, and the Bluetooth has all of the high-quality codecs. Of course, given how nicely the ZD3 will pair with Fosi Audio's other devices such as their power amps, Fosi Audio have also included a 12-volt trigger output so you can have the ZD3 switch on your downstream amplifier. So that's all fantastic, but this is also where we start to hit a few bumps in the road. Potentially, one of the strongest features of the ZD3 is the ability to swap op amps. That's the chip, or in this case chips, inside the DAC that output the analog signal after it's come out of the DAC chip. There are 3 chips in total within the ZD3. That means there's 2 for XLR outputs and 1 for the RCA outputs. And so you can swap all of them or some of them. If you're swapping the XLR ones, you have to swap both. If you're just using RCA, you can just swap that one. But the key point is you can swap them around to change the sound and potentially improve the sound of the ZD3. The stock op amps are the Texas Instruments LME 49720s, but at one point the ZD3 was also shipping with some extra op amps, and I don't know if that's a long-term thing or if it was a pre-order thing, but at one stage they were also shipping with the JRC 4580D op amps included in the packet if you wanted to swap them around. So the Texas Instruments op amps are the stock inclusions, but you could choose to add in or roll the JRCs if you wanted to. Theoretically, therefore, you can also use other more premium op amps like those from Sparco's Labs, Burson Audio, Staccato, and maybe others. And the good thing is that larger op amps like the Burson Audio V7 Vivids do fit, so you could use them, but you might not want to. Now, before I release you from that cliffhanger, let's talk about the process of swapping op amps in the ZD3, because it's not so straightforward. Unfortunately, Fosi Audio decided that the best solution for having the rear outputs switch between being variable or volume controlled from the ZD3, or having them as a fixed line output at a constant high volume, was to apply a switch on the bottom of the device that essentially just bypasses the internal volume control. The switch works well enough for its intended purpose, although it is a bit of a fiddle to get to if you've got this stacked up with other components, but where it actually creates an issue is when it comes time to op amp roll. And that's because at least the first time you do this, you have to remove the switch from the casework. You have to undo the screws and pop it out of where it sits. And that's because the switch is connected via a cable to the mainboard of the ZD3, and so you can't take the mainboard out unless you take the switch with it. That's not such a big deal, but then trying to refit the switch as you slide the board back in can be really fiddly and frustrating. Another alternative is the first time you remove the board, you can actually remove the adhesive that holds the plug in place that keeps the cable from the switch connected to the mainboard, and that means in future you'll be able to wiggle out that plug before you take out the mainboard and leave the switch in place. If you're going to be doing this regularly, that's the approach I would recommend, but do be aware it is still fiddly. When I first received the ZD3 from Fosi Audio, I produced a short video talking about its release and also the release of the VOL20 or the VOL20 Bluetooth volume control unit, and that was a while back now, and I completely forgot the state that I'd left the ZD3 in after that video, and that created an accidental blind test. When it came time to produce this video for you, I set up the ZD3 alongside the similarly priced SMSL D6S DAC. I ran Super Sword XLR cables from both DACs into the Burson Audio Voyager headphone amp, and that allowed me to switch seamlessly back and forth between the two DACs to see how they compared. And I was fairly disappointed to notice that the ZD3 sounded significantly inferior compared to the D6S. I say significantly not to say that the margin was huge, but it was clear and obvious. It was enough of a difference that I really didn't see the ZD3 stacking up to a DAC like the D6S unless you very, very specifically needed the HDMI ARC connector that the D6S doesn't have. And by the way, it's HDMI ARC only, it's not an I2S connector. The other argument that maybe you could have made for the ZD3 at this point was that if you were happy to spend extra money and fiddle around to roll op amps, then maybe it could catch up and overtake the D6S. And so, to be thorough about things, I popped open the ZD3 to swap over the op amps. Except that I already had. What was already installed in the ZD3 from my original introduction video about the ZD3 were the normally amazing Burson Audio V7 Vivid op amps. And so that combination, which is significantly more expensive than the stock D6S, sounded noticeably inferior to the D6S. And that was a worry. Even with the Burson Audio V7 Vivids installed in the ZD3, the basic stock little D6S DAC sounded more rounded and more natural in its tonality. It was exactly the opposite of what I would have expected. In other words, the ZD3 with the premium op amps sounded flatter and less natural overall. As I said before, the difference wasn't huge, but the SMSL DAC was clearly more enjoyable to my ears despite running a much more basic setup than the ZD3 with the premium Burson op amps. Now, whenever I'm faced with results like this that don't initially make sense, I always try to listen more and find at least one aspect of the sound that's maybe positive. But I couldn't hear. There was nothing about the sound from the ZD3 with the V7 Vivids that I felt was better. And so now that I knew that this was the sound from the ZD3 with what is probably the best op amps that you can fit inside its case, I started to worry. If this was the sound from the ZD3 with premium op amps, what would happen on the stock ones? As it turns out, when I put the LME 49720s back into the ZD3, it sounded much closer to the D6S. Now, as I switch between the two inputs on the Burson Voyager with the ZD3 in its stock setup versus the D6S, I could hear a difference, but it was really subtle. It was really just the tiniest shift in tonality that was enough that no one would pick it if you weren't rapidly switching between the two. And so basically, if you're going to keep these in their stock setup, the D6S and the ZD3 are interchangeable DACs. Choose based on the look, the size, and the features that you want. And on that note, I do think the D6S feels just a little bit better made than the ZD3. The ZD3 physically feels like it was built to a budget, whereas I don't ever think about the D6S as a cheap DAC, it's just a really compact one. It still feels quite premium, and the casework looks like it's better finished than the ZD3. However, we can't wrap things up there because I still had at least 2 more different op amps to try. And particularly, we need to talk about those JRC op amps because they came in the box, and therefore we need to know how they sound. And the answer is, they sound great. With the JRC 4580Ds installed in the ZD3, now the ZD3 was slightly preferable to my ears over the D6S. The JRC chips raised the level of detail retrieval ever so slightly, so you were getting a better sense of resolution out of the ZD3 compared to the D6S, but it was done in a way that was enjoyable and therefore gave the ZD3 to my ears an edge over the D6S. The JRC chips also shifted the center image slightly, so your main vocalist or instrumentals. It was brought slightly forward, but not claustrophobic or congested, just a little bit more forward, a little bit more focused, and it actually raised it slightly in the soundstage. Now, none of that's necessarily good or bad, it's just different. And so if you did get the ZD3 with the JRC op amps, I personally would recommend giving them a go. Depending on system synergy and personal preferences, you may still prefer the stock Texas Instruments op amps, but if you're anything like me with similar preferences and similar gear, I think you'll find the JRCs are a really nice option. But all of this was still leaving a big question mark in my mind as to whether or not it's worth looking into other more premium op amps in the ZD3. Fosi Audio list the Sparkos Labs SS3602s on their website, and so I figured maybe they'd be a good match in the ZD3. Perhaps the technical requirements of the Burson V7 Vivids in terms of things like their voltage requirements were beyond what the ZD3 is designed to deliver optimally, and maybe the 3602s would work better. And so I installed a set of the SS3602s from Sparkos, and I do think the sound got a bit better, but it wasn't by a very big margin. And I know from other DACs that changing the op amps can make a huge difference in the sound. And so whilst there was probably a little bit more space in the soundstage, maybe a touch more clarity and focus in the image, I don't think the ZD3 is a DAC where I would recommend upgrading the op amps, not beyond the basic chip-based designs. And so if you are looking to play with the ZD3 and roll through some op amps, I would personally stick to the chip-based designs. I wouldn't spend the extra on the premium, discrete designs like the 3602s, which are their own little circuit board all with different components. I would just stick to the monolithic chip-based designs. In other words, things like the included JRCs if you got them, maybe some OPA 1656s, any of those good but still very cheap chip-based op amps. And if that's the path you go down, I think the ZD3 is a solid choice. It can be good fun, but do be aware it's not going to set the world on fire. It's a good, solid budget DAC that's going to stack beautifully with other Fosi gear because it's all going to look the part together. But if you don't want to fiddle with op amps or volume switch removal or even having a volume switch that you've got to get underneath a DAC to get to, or if maybe you want what I think is a nicer finished and nicer looking DAC for about the same money, then check out my review up here of the SMSL D6S that I spoke about earlier. That's an awesome little DAC and it goes head to head, as you've already heard, with the ZD3. For now, I want to say a huge thanks to channel members here on YouTube, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on YouTube videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.